Hey, I'm Zarina Matcha, and you're watching The Rational Female, formerly known as Non-Feminist Gal. Before I start this video, I'd like to make it very clear that I am not in favour of men and women returning to traditional, stagnant gender roles. Society has evolved, and for good reason. It's a good thing that more women are in the workplace and that men are no longer expected to be the primary financial breadwinners in society. However, on this channel, I present the view that the move away from traditional gender roles was not because of feminism. It was because of birth control, the Industrial Revolution, and the rise of modern digital and technological appliances. These are the things which truly liberated women, as opposed to the post-1960s Western feminist movement as pioneered by Betty Friedan. In this video, I'm going to break down why gender roles, or more accurately, gender differences between men and women, are not sexist, and why we have evolved from traditional gender roles, and what this can mean for the future. Please know that I am not a scientist or a biologist, and I think that after watching this video, you should check out the books that I've recommended in the description box. I do highly recommend checking out the Paradox Institute, which is a fantastic YouTube channel that breaks down sex and gender differences from a scientific and apolitical perspective. So a few months back, I read a wonderful book by a sexologist named Dr. Deborah So. This book is called The End of Gender, and it's all about the science and biology behind sex and gender differences in men and women. It's written in very accessible terms for those who are perhaps not so scientifically versed. So, like myself, has very liberal, egalitarian, and rather socially progressive views. She is very pro-trans, very pro-LGBT in general, and writes with a degree of kindness and empathy towards trans people, gay people, and gender non-conforming people. Yet what she does that's really important is that she accepts and explores the key differences between men and women, and why for us to keep moving forward and keep progressing in our world, we can't deny that there are biological and evolutionary differences between men and women. Contrary to what we are being sold in modern society, courtesy of wokeism, which derives from social constructionism and cultural or neo-Marxism, gender is not a social construct. Gender is rooted in biology, not sociology. There are only two biological sexes that exist in humans, male and female. This is not right-wing or conservative or anything of the sort, it's just a fact. Sex is defined not by chromosomes or body parts, but by gametes. There are only two gametes, male sperm and female eggs. This is what determines a person's sex. Sex is not a spectrum, it is a binary. Sex is not bimodal, and most people who say this are speaking from a social constructionist perspective, which I'll touch on later in the video. Gender is then defined by hormones in the brain. The hormones that are secreted in the womb define what a person's gender identity is. At about 7 weeks after conception, if the embryo is male, then the testes will secrete testosterone, which masculinizes the brain. If the embryo is female, then this process does not occur. So technically, we all initially start off as women. Yay! Female empowerment! Not feminism! Men have far more testosterone in their bodies than women do. In The Rational Male, Rollo Tomasi states that men have 12 to 17 times more testosterone in their bodies than women. Some sources I've looked at even say that men have as much as 20 times the amount. By contrast, women have more estrogen. These hormones affect our bodies and our emotional temperaments, such as our aggression levels, how much hair we have on our bodies, how much we desire sex, and so on. This is not a choice. People do not choose to be male or female. There are two sexes and thus two genders, as gender is derived from one's biological sex. Sex is defined by gametes, and gender is defined by hormones. I did A-level psychology, and we were taught about genotype and phenotype. Genotype is what provides genetic information about someone's sex, such as their DNA and chromosomes. Phenotype is what determines external characteristics known as secondary sex characteristics, such as men having facial hair and testicles or women having breasts. None of this should be controversial, and yet for some insane reason it's become that way. I don't know what happened to make us be living in a world where saying that there are only two genders or that men and women are different on a physical and psychological level is now dubbed controversial. I do think that feminism has played a large role in this, which I'll go on to later, but I really can't see how anyone can truly believe that women and men are effectively carbon copies of one another when this is clearly untrue. We're literally taught in school that men and women have different bodies and undergo different processes during puberty. This is basic common sense and serves as a foundation in understanding the sexes. Up until the 1960s and 1970s, sex and gender were used interchangeably. Then, around the 1960s, with the rise of social constructionism, this neo-Marxist or cultural Marxist view of gender started to become more prevalent. The idea of social constructionism is that there's no such thing as a physical reality, and physical reality is only agreed upon via collective consensus. I do agree to some extent that there are things that are subjective, arguably many things, and there are things that we can't see, things that are metaphysical. But I'm concerned as to whether these ideas have a place in the natural sciences, as the natural sciences are supposed to be as objective and evidence-based as they can. I think philosophy and the humanities are the places to ruminate and discuss theories, but the role of science is to analyze these theories through the empirical scientific method. That isn't to say that the subjective and the objective can't meet each other. Lots of scientists do and have believed in many metaphysical things. I myself believe in metaphysical things, like I believe that we all have a soul and I believe in spirits, but these things exist outside of the natural world. That's why we have the term supernatural. I don't think that we should be conflating subjective metaphysical beliefs with that which is supposed to be objective and empirical. This brings me to gender. Gender is supposed to be something that we look at from a biological, scientific standpoint. When this becomes infected by subjective ideologies, such as social constructionism, then we lose that ability to remain objective, because there's nothing absolute that we are all agreeing upon. If we all agree on the scientific version of gender, which is that gender is a biological reality based upon someone's sex and defined by hormones and secondary sex characteristics, then we have a clear foundation and a baseline to which we can all agree upon. Thus, we can say that certain characteristics are more typical of men and certain characteristics are more typical of women. The idea of gender as being something separate from sex was actually popularized by a psychologist named John Money. A lot of contemporary gender activists don't talk about this, and I know it's only one case study, but it's something which shouldn't be ignored due to how serious it is. John Money was a psychologist from New Zealand who believed that gender was a social construct and that one's gender identity could be separate from one's biological sex. He's the one who can be credited with popularizing this idea, which feminist Kate Millett touches upon in her book Sexual Politics, that presents an extremely social constructionist view of gender relations. In 1965, two parents came to Dr. Money for help after their son's penis was accidentally damaged from a failed circumcision. The baby boy was called David Reimer, and he was socialized as a girl and given hormonal treatment and a constructed vulva. As he grew up, David realized that he was in fact a boy and later had his treatment reversed. He later spoke out against the treatment that happened to him and unfortunately committed suicide at the age of 38. This case is extremely important as it highlights the danger that can be done when we claim that gender is socially constructed. Gender is not a choice. You cannot just socialize someone to be a boy or a girl. Our gender identity is something we are aware of from a very young age, and that goes for trans people as well. I think that most trans people are aware of their gender identity from a young age and that their gender identity does not match their biological sex. When we create this idea that gender is a social construct, then it also means that sexuality is a social construct. If you can choose to be a boy or a girl or something else, then surely you can then choose who you are attracted to. This then becomes very harmful for homosexuals who have fought to say that being gay is not a choice and that you can't just undergo gay conversion therapy in order to stop being gay. There is definite fluidity in how we may express our gender and sexuality, but to say that these are completely socially constructed rather than real, hardwired biological realities is very harmful and very anti-scientific. We are seeing this today in how many people want to push these ideas of gender neutrality and social constructionism onto children by teaching children that they can choose their gender and that if they feel like their gender is wrong, they can just take puberty blockers and so on. Now, this brings me to the discussion of gender roles. I think that when people hear the term gender roles, they think that it means that men can have jobs and women belong in the kitchen. Yet this isn't what it means at all. Gender simply means that men and women typically have different roles in life based on our biological functions. This is why, since the agrarian age, men have been the ones who typically worked outside of the home and provided, while women typically stayed with their children and worked inside the home. This isn't to say that women never worked outside of the home or had careers. I have a video on 20 women throughout human history who have been leaders and pioneers in various fields. However, all this means is that the reasoning for women typically being the ones who were at home and men being the ones who worked was not because of sexism, it was because of biology and our working around our complementary gender differences. It's very unfortunate that the feminist narrative is one that pushes this idea of all women having been oppressed by gender roles, yet this really isn't true and even sounds like a conspiracy theory. Not to mention, it discounts many women throughout human history who have also done great things alongside being a wife and mother, or even instead of being a wife and mother. During the Second World War, thousands of women worked outside of the home, so I'm not even sure where feminism got this really strange idea that women had never ever been able to work outside of the home. The Second World War occurred 2 decades before the feminist movement, so feminists really shouldn't have been pushing such an entirely false narrative that women have never been able to work outside of the home, especially when even in the most recent 2 centuries since the Industrial Revolution, that has really not been the case at all. As mentioned at the start of this video, nowadays men and women no longer have to abide by strict gender roles, but this isn't because of feminism, it's because of advancements in society. Contraception allowed women to plan our fertility so that we can pursue a career or other life avenues and not be bound by our fertility. For the majority of women, this is a good thing, as it means that women who are young can focus on their careers or have sexual partners without worrying about getting pregnant. This isn't just for single women either. Married women or women in long-term relationships can benefit greatly from fertility planning as well. By the way, the contraceptive pill was invented by a man. Yes, a man named Gregory Goodwin Pincus. I have several videos discussing this as well as abortion. Women should thank the men who made our lives easier, not feminism. It's a very common misconception that feminism is responsible for the rights that women have today, including contraception, yet this is really not true at all. Most feminists view being a woman as fundamentally oppressive because they believe that we live in a world where women are viewed as unequal to men. This automatically puts women in a position of weakness and teaches us that being a woman is of less value than being a man is. It demeans traditional femininity such as housewifery, nursing, domestic activities, creativity, and the like. Feminism has totally demeaned being a housewife or a stay-at-home mother as something for women to aspire to because it views these as oppressive social constructs. As mentioned earlier, Kate Miller's seminal text, Sexual Politics, which is almost a precursor to contemporary wokeism, speaks so poorly of the female role and the state of womanhood as a form of oppression. Judith Butler is also a very well-known academic and feminist scholar who can be credited with reinforcing the idea of gender being a performance and that men and women behave in certain ways because of social expectation rather than because of our hardwired biology and evolutionary differences. These women, like most feminists, seem to have a chip on their shoulder for being born female. I don't quite understand why feminists despise womanhood so much, or why feminism is so against gender roles and gender differences. I imagine this is something to do with Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem, the 2 women who pioneered the contemporary Western feminist movement, both having been in unhappy and mutually abusive marriages. The feminine mystique outlines the problem with no name, i.e. being a housewife, and claims that millions of middle-class American women were unhappy being housewives. Of course, we know that this is not the case. For example, Carolyn Graglia, author of Domestic Tranquility, spent years studying law and achieved a very successful legal career before the feminist movement took off. She left her career to care for her family out of personal choice and fulfillment, not because she felt oppressed. And she was certainly never held back from pursuing a legal career. In fact, she achieved a great deal in her field. I don't deny that some women were, or are, bored being housewives or stay-at-home mothers, but instead of encouraging women to find new ways of personal fulfillment, such as taking up a hobby, going back to university, or starting a part-time business, Friedan declared that marriage was a comfortable concentration camp and that housewives were unpaid slaves and other ridiculous hyperbole. It's rather ironic that most feminists claim that women are an oppressed social class, but that many claim that the solution to this is to dismantle gender completely. This is very ironic because if we dismantle gender, then we erase women as a supposedly oppressed class, meaning that feminism effectively becomes redundant, as if women no longer exist, then what place does feminism have in society? J.K. Rowling actually argued for this in her essay on why she spoke out about the conversation around sex and gender. While I certainly don't agree with Rowling's feminist views, I do think that she makes an important point. This point has created a staunch division within the contemporary feminist framework. Feminists like Kathleen Stock, Louise Perry, and Julie Bindel have all spoken up about defending the biological reality that is sex. The reason for this is that, in their minds, women are an oppressed social class, so if we erase this biological definition of gender, women's struggles are no longer paid any attention to, as women are obsolete, therefore feminism is rendered as meaningless. Once again, the irony of this is that the idea of eradicating gender roles is part of what feminism was founded upon. The goal of feminism has always been to liberate women from our gender role, i.e. liberating women from being women. The role of women doesn't have anything to do with being a housewife or a stay-at-home mother. I am a proud career-oriented woman. I always have been. It's about accepting that women and men have physical and psychological differences that affect our life choices and working within these differences in a complementary manner. Men and women are supposed to complement each other. Even on a spiritual level, masculine and feminine energy is meant to work together, as this is what the universe is made up of. By the way, I'm not denying that there have ever been times where gender roles have been used to push rigid expectations onto both men and women. But the key here is that abiding by strict gender roles has not only negatively impacted women, it has also negatively impacted men, and feminism never ever takes anything into account for regarding men's issues or men's struggles. Since the agrarian age, for the last, we'll say, 12 to 15,000 years, men have primarily been expected to take on more responsibility through working, providing, and fighting in the majority of wars. It's a real privilege that women have been looked after by men to raise and bear our children, and that in the process, men have created things like contraception to make women's lives easier. Before feminism, there was a much larger appreciation for men in society, but feminism has created a culture of distrust by pushing a narrative that women are oppressed by a male-dominated patriarchy. Even the idea of patriarchy wasn't so much about oppressing women, it was about protecting women, specifically mothers, and delegating a large amount of social and political responsibility onto men so that women could safely conceive and raise their children. Through adopting social constructionist views around gender, feminism has pushed a narrative that any difference in male and female behavior and lifestyle choices is the result of systemic sexism. One example is neo-Marxists, a term coined by feminist scholar Cordelia Fine in 2008. Fine's book, Delusions of Gender, was published in 2010, and is another contributor to the roster of feminist literature out there, which pushes this narrative of women being oppressed by our gender roles, society being sexist towards women, and everything that women endure being the result of some conspiratorial patriarchy. Once again, I'm not denying that sexism is a real thing. Some men are and have been sexist towards women, and obviously that isn't okay. When men are sexist towards women, we call them misogynists, and rightfully so. But when women are sexist towards men, we call them feminists, and we say that they are empowered. Feminism is an appallingly sexist ideology in how it frames and examines gender differences. The majority of feminists argue their positions on gender from a view that is rife with hostility towards men and undermines women by calling us oppressed. Thus, feminism is really rather sexist towards women as well as men. Understanding this is crucial to understand the contemporary woke narrative of there being more than two genders and of gender being a social construct. To understand wokeism, we have to understand cultural Marxism, otherwise known as neo-Marxism, social constructionism, intersectionality, and we must certainly understand feminism. Until people start to really understand that feminism is not about empowering women or gaining equality, that it's actually supremely toxic and sexist and rooted in conspiratorial thinking, then we won't really learn how to move towards a truly egalitarian world, a world where men and women can truly work together and coexist peacefully, just as we are supposed to. If you look at most religions and most spiritual philosophies, they discuss the concept of the masculine and the feminine. In Taoism, we have yin and yang, which represents masculine and feminine energy. In astrology, we have masculine and feminine zodiac signs. In the Bible, there are men and there are women. And then in science, we have male and female. The only set of ideas that claims that gender doesn't exist is social constructionism. This idea is very strange and rather unnatural because it goes against what is such a huge part of humanity, that there are two sexes who coexist with one another in order to reproduce. The masculine and the feminine are there to complement one another from both a scientific and a spiritual perspective. Now, to be clear, I have absolutely nothing against people wanting to call themselves non-binary, gender fluid, or some other term that they wish. But this is a subculture, and we shouldn't be accepting this as a biological reality. If somebody wants to call themselves something as a form of self-expression, then that's their choice. But to say that this is a scientific fact is completely ridiculous. Non-binary is an invented term that I personally see as essentially a new way of saying that one doesn't fully identify as a super masculine man or a super feminine woman, and perhaps is more androgynous or wants to not necessarily conform to conventional gender roles. Yet what's rather odd is that, in all honesty, everyone is technically non-binary to some extent, as no one is 100% masculine nor 100% feminine. We all have a mix of masculine and feminine characteristics within us. These characteristics are shaped by our brains, and then society works around these differences by allowing us to make the most of our unique strengths as men and women. There are literally thousands of ways for men and women to express our gender or express our sexuality and express how we wish to dress and behave. Yet this doesn't mean that there are now more than two biological genders. David Bowie and Prince are men who experimented with gender expression. Lady Gaga and Grace Jones are women who have experimented with gender expression, but this doesn't make them entirely new gender. Prince was still a man and Grace Jones is still a woman. Communities like the Hijra or the Native American Two-Spirit have different gender expressions, but this is a cultural thing that has nothing to do with Western social constructionist gender activism, and I don't think it's fair or even logical to try and use something which is culturally different to explain this very modern neo-Marxist concept of gender. Interesting how the woke crowd constantly complain about cultural appropriation, yet isn't comparing Two-Spirit and the Hijra essentially a form of appropriating someone else's culture as a way to reinforce their rather strange, very Western and white Anglophonic dominated view of social constructionist gender norms? I mean, hypocritical. Let me be very clear. I think people should be free to express their gender however they wish and to adopt feminine and masculine characteristics to whatever extent they wish to. Men have a right to wear dresses and women have a right to grow facial hair if they want to, but that doesn't change what you are at the core. If I shave my head and wear butch clothing, I'm still a woman. Butch lesbians are still women. Effeminate men are still men. We shouldn't be erasing biological understandings of sex and gender just because some people wish to experiment with their external gender expression. As for trans people, I take a transmedicalist stance, which views gender dysphoria as a medical condition. I completely support adults over the age of 18 at the very minimum, being able to medically transition, undergo hormone replacement therapy, and live as their preferred sex if that is what they choose and they've consulted this with a doctor. I do think that we need a more nuanced conversation around transgenderism, which isn't coming from the cultural Marxist, woke, social constructionist worldview. In order to truly help trans people live their best lives, we need to invest more in the biological view of sex and gender, as otherwise anyone can just say that they're a man without any real scientific evidence or a medical diagnosis. That's not what being trans is supposed to mean. I really respect Buck Angel, an outspoken transsexual advocate for a more transmedicalist view on sex and gender and an outspoken advocate for trans rights. I'm against children transitioning, and I do think that giving children puberty blockers is a very bad idea due to the long-term health effects. Statistically speaking, based on 11 long-term studies, 60 to 90% of teenagers who experience gender dysphoria will grow out of it once they emerge into adulthood. Most people are not trans, and being trans and having gender dysphoria, which is a medical condition, affects a very small minority of the human population. They deserve support and they deserve medical care, but they can't receive this if we continue to push the social constructionist narrative of gender that continues to ignore biology. But what do you think? Is gender a sexist social construct? Are men and women different, or are we all the same? Are there any concepts in this video that I was a little fuzzy on? Do let me know, and thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, do consider subscribing to stay up to date with the content that I post, and do consider joining my Discord group Liberals Against Feminism for discussions around feminism with like-minded people. The end. The end. It's the end of gender. Gender is over. We are now entering a post-gender society. Now entering the Twilight Zone! Dun, dun! Dun, 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 dun.